everyone who's watching and listening this. Hi guys, welcome to the Differentiators. I am Aditya, your host for today, and I have with me Shreyas and Yashas as my co-hosts. In our show, The Differentiators, we talk to achievers from various backgrounds to understand their journeys, which will help us unlock key insights and ideas that will stimulate learning and growth. So our today's differentiator is Mr. Balaji Ramesh. Balaji started his career in entrepreneurship in early 2015 when he quit his job at Deloitte to embark on the journey of entrepreneurship. His first company that he co-founded was Groombaba, which was an e-commerce platform that enabled consumers to book salon and spa appointments online. It's pretty interesting, by the way. Right now, he's the co-founder and CEO of Nordforth, whose vision is to provide actionable insights about human behavior and soft skills so that people can upgrade to the best version of themselves. So welcome, Balaji. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. More than happy to talk to fellow entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's get to it. So my first question is, we'll start from your journey right from Deloitte. So what were you doing in Deloitte and what was your role there? Can you just brief on that?
Okay, so Deloitte, I joined, that Deloitte was my first job. I joined as a business technology analyst was my role on paper. And then I was working for a US healthcare client. Mm-hmm. So at that time, Obamacare and all of that and US healthcare was undergoing massive changes. So I was working with a bunch of hospitals for the system changes and all of that. And I did multiple projects, but that was the most part of it. That was the maximum length that I was part of in a project. Then I did some internal projects for Deloitte as well. But then after this healthcare project is in 2015 is when I quit and started my first company. You want to know anything specific about Deloitte? Feel free to ask me.
Yeah, sure. Actually, we're more interested in your entrepreneurial journey as opposed to Deloitte as such. But yes, if you want to share something which you did there, then you're most welcome.
Okay, so all right. So in 2015, I'll answer this question anyway. I don't know if you want to know this answer or not, because a lot of people ask me this question: why I decided to move from a stable corporate job and working in a big four company, and then moving directly into
that was my next question.
Starting a company of my own, because a lot of people, what they do is they fear this uncertainty where you just jump right into it. I've seen a lot of people. In fact, I've also advised a lot of people to not directly start a company of your own. But if you're so scared about the uncertainty bit, what you should do is you should go and work with a startup first to get that experience. And then you go ahead and start a company. Work with a startup for 1 or 2 years so that you get that flavor of what entrepreneurship is and what sort of struggles the startup faces. And then you go on and build a company of your own. But the reason I did it was around 2014, in 2015 is when I quit, but around 2014, I was surrounded by a lot of entrepreneurs. To be honest, I was part of the whole entrepreneurial circuit, and slowly I started getting involved. I started to attend a lot of events and all of it. Pre-2014, I had no idea about what entrepreneurship was. So that was a year where I sort of started getting exposed to so many entrepreneurs and so many new ideas, and it was all exciting. At Deloitte, I was performing like left, right, and center. So I was top rated, and to the extent that I used to go to office pretty late, and my manager wouldn't say anything to me because I would just tell her that, hey, my performance is not getting affected, right? So you shouldn't really put. So I was an entrepreneur that itself, right? So I would just say, see, if I'm not performing, then you tell me. But don't ask me to come at 9 o'clock to the office, right? So I would just walk in at 12 and do my job and just get away with it. So managers, they're pretty flexible. One thing that I really, really liked about Deloitte, which has an influence on me, which has had an influence and still is on my mind all the time, is the culture that they have, right? So they've always allowed flat organization. You can go and talk to even the director of the company. You can go and sit with the senior manager, understand what they are doing. Pretty open, flat organization. So that's something that Deloitte has taught me a lot, and I'm very happy to have been a part of all that and all the learning experience. But then it was so by 2015 is when I realized whatever I'm doing at Deloitte is not making me happy. You know, I may be performing very good. I may be making my managers happy, but then it's not making me happy. I wanted to do more. Always that workaholic sort of a mindset I had. So I wanted to do more. I wanted to make myself happy, wanted satisfaction. And because I was exposed to the whole entrepreneurship circuit, and I was my roommate at that time, he was an IIT Kharagpur graduate, and he was also had a company of his own. And then he and his friends were all constantly, and when you're constantly exposed to something like this and you're working with them and you're discussing ideas with them, you sort of develop that. And then that's when I realized that, hey, this is something that if I do it, it's going to make me happy. And if I fail, it's going to be a lot of learning experience. So I knew that in 2015. So I decided to take the leap. I quit the job. I decided that, hey, so early 2015 is when I started talking to a friend of mine. He was working with another company, a product company at that time. And then I was talking to him and I told him this idea. I said, hey, this is a market that I think can grow. It's a market. So you never know if a market can grow or not. You never know if a product would work or not. But I thought this is something that is the need of the hour at that point. And so the idea was simple. Idea with Groombaba was a book my show for salons and spas. You could book an appointment. You just go there, right? That's how we started. That's what I told him, and then he got hooked. Then he said, hey, fine, let's just do it. So he quit his job. I quit my job. Both of us just got in this together. Both of us together started this company. We pulled in our money. We hired a few people. We hired some interns, and we got a few full-time roles also. And then slowly we built the product, we built the website, the appointment booking platform, and all of that. We got some salons in, all of that. And then it was about a year when the pressure started to build, wherein we were doing sales all right, we were doing revenues and all of that, but then we wanted to grow more, right? So we were not able to, let's put it this way, we were not able to scale to the level where we would have enough money to call ourselves, successful entrepreneurs, right? So at that time, we had not raised funds, right? So we were just on revenue, and most of the revenue we were not filling our pockets. We were putting it back to the business and doing a lot of marketing and burning on that. So at that point is when this was 8 months into the business. That's when we realized that, hey, what we need to do right now is go ahead and raise funds, because now we have a established business model, and this is the time we should go and raise funds. And that's when reality hit us. All of this is brutal truth, okay? So I'm giving you guys everything that I have. So at that time, now we're 8 months into 2015 since we started. We started in I think May 2015, and 8 months into it, we started approaching investors. A lot of investors we approached, we spoke to, and then something reality hit us, because 8 months ago when we started the business, we had no competitors, zero. The market was fresh. We had nobody, right? Anything that you Google about it, there would not even be articles. Forget your story. There would not even be articles by Times of India or anyone who would be doing something similar to this. 8 months later, when we actually decided to go ahead and raise an investment, the investors started telling us that Balaji, there are 15 other company is doing this. Why would I want to invest in you? What is it that is unique in you? Why would I want to invest in you? So then we went back to our drawing board, started doing Google search and research, and then we realized that there are actually more than 15 companies that are in fact revenue generating and have raised funds. The market started getting overcrowded. I had some contacts with the VC firms also, so I started reaching out to them, and they also had the same thing to say, right? So right now, when the market gets overcrowded, only VCs think about one thing. It is that they don't want to invest in 15 companies. What they'll do is they'll wait for companies to die out, and then wait for the 5 companies that survive in that market, the 5 companies that dominate that market, and then they'll go ahead and invest in those 5 companies, right? So if you look at the top 5 VCs, that's the level that they're looking at. They don't want to go and give money to somebody and want to grow them. They want them to sustain and survive, and then they'll invest their money in that. So at that time, we were running short of money. We were burning a lot of money, and then investment was something that we needed. We went ahead. We actually closed a deal as well. But then what had happened was my co-founder sort of had a deadline to when he told me that, hey, Balaji, this is the time that we have to go ahead and raise an investment. And if you don't do this by this time, then I can't do this anymore. It's the kind of, and I respect that. It's okay. Everybody has their own personal needs and requirements. So we had actually closed the deal, but before that time, we were through the term sheet negotiations and all of that. And during that time, we decided the investor may actually not be right for us. So it was between going ahead with any investment versus doing the right thing. And I decided to just do the right thing, drop it there. And he moved out. He was the CTO. He was taking care of the technology bit completely. So he moved out, and then we slowly, eventually shut down the business. That took a lot of time. Shutting down the business is even more difficult than starting a business in India, by the way. But we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, that's what something that's called the Chakravyuha problem that was referred to by the economic advisor. Yeah. So, I mean, that actually shows the amount of discipline that actually needs to go with entrepreneurs. You need to recognize when to actually close down something as well. And it must actually be tough as well, no? You know, like you spend each day in and out trying to do something better, but then at the end you'll have to pull the plug as well. So, and that actually shows a lot of discipline too.
Yeah, you have to, because you need to know the right time. Stretching it too much is just gonna either take a toll on you, or it's just gonna be waste of time. So you need to know when you need to pull the plug and then move on. That's something that every entrepreneur needs to know. But then, having said this, I also would like to sort of add a star mark of conditions applied here, because a lot of people say this. I've heard so many people talk about this, saying, if whatever idea that you're working on, if it doesn't work in let's say a span of time, a few months, 6 months, you try the idea, then you pivot to something else, right? I've heard so many people say this. In fact, investors would push you to do this. Investors, they'll come on board. They'll be part of your board. They'll control your decision making. They'll invest money in you. And then if it doesn't work, obviously, if they have money, they want to make money out of it. So they'll be like, hey, just pivot to something else that actually works, that the consumers want at this point, right? So many examples you could see. I'm not sure how popular your podcast is going to be and how much beaten up I can get, but I'm just going to drop in some names here. You could see Swiggy, for example, started with food delivery, and then now they have normal grocery delivery and all of that. So they just, everybody's trying to be everything, right? They want to venture into everything. Instead of doing one thing right, they're venturing into everything. So that sort of tends to happen. So I would, whatever I have done with Groom Baba, my first business, is not the ideal. I've made a lot of mistakes in that. So the first mistake that I would say is not doing my competitor analysis, not just the beginning of the business, but not doing an active competitor analysis throughout my business. So what I should have done is invested some time in actually sitting and researching about my competitors pretty much every week, because every week there's somebody new coming up, right? So that's one. Second is that the kind of timeline that I have now, that in retrospect that I sit and understand, the kind of timeline that I had for myself, or the timeline that I had given, or my co-founder had at that point, was way too short to do any business. In fact, especially a consumer business, especially if you're doing a B2C business, you need way more time. You need way more time and way more oxygen. And the third most important learning lesson that I got from Groombaba is that if it's a consumer business, right? Consumer business needs marketing, you need to do a lot of marketing and needs a lot of funds. So if you are going the funding path, go to it early. Don't delay it. I waited for 8 months, and that, I think, in my opinion, was a big mistake. I should have gone at it because we had a product and everything rolling out, and we had our revenues and all of that coming in about 4-5 months. Right? So that's when I should have started hitting the investors. It takes time. I delayed it. There were more businesses, more competition. Market started getting overcrowded. That was the time. What is this business? Forgetting the name. Those who do home salons now.
Urban Clap or something?
Sorry?
Urban Clap?
Urban Clap. Yeah, that was about the time when Urban Clap got into. They had raised their first round and all of that. Nykaa was a company that raised their round. Another salon, the whole salon business, they moved. I'm forgetting the name, but another big salon business, they moved to home as well as salon in-house salon and all of that. So they started doing both, and then the shift started becoming, including investors, became more interested in how home salons are going to function, rather than looking at we were approaching it with a complete different mindset, right? So what we were doing is we were focusing more on the hairstylist. Right? Instead of promoting the salons, we wanted to move to hairstylists, where people would come to the salons, they would book an appointment, come to the salon, and would be able to choose their own hairstylist. So that's the direction we were moving in, whereas the market and all the other startups started with appointment booking, and then slowly moved to home appointments. Okay. And that was not something that at that point I saw was feasible. I still don't think that happened. That business has taken off. I don't know why Urban Clap still has it.
I think COVID has given them a lifeline.
Has it? Because I would be extremely wary of people coming into my place to cut my hair, especially during COVID.
But I have seen people booking Urban Clap for salons.
Yeah, it's a possibility. So
yeah.
Again, we need to do that research. I'm out of it now.
Correct.
So I don't keep track of it. But anyway, it might be true. Sometimes it does happen that there is a wave of things that happen, and then something picks up. Like Paytm happened the moment Modi announced demonetization. Paytm just was the leader instantly, right? Overnight. So those kind of things happen. You can't rely on that anyway as a business. But yes. So I told you 3 things, right? And the 4th thing something interesting happened during that time, which I would also want to mention, put it out there here. So what had happened was, after that time, when we realized there is more competition, meeting has been upgraded. Okay. Yes. So during that time, when we started to realize there's competition, there are more people in the market, we were going in and adding more businesses to our, more partners, right? We call them partners. So these are salons who paid us some commission on every transaction. So when we approached newer salons, newer businesses, we realized something, that these salons and businesses were approached by other uh, startups as well, right? Other companies as well. But that's fine. They're okay to do business with multiple. There is no clause which says you can't do business with anyone else, right? You can do business with. But the problem is when these businesses did not do a good job with these partners. That means they had payment dues with these businesses. They had behavioral problems, and there were times when I have been pushed out of the door by just saying, you cannot, I don't want to do business with any of you guys because I have 5 lakhs of pending payment from one of you guys. For them, it's just startups, right? Approaching them. The new industry is just startups approaching them. So that started to happen, and that's where it hit me, right? We're late. For businesses with investments, with deep pockets, it's still easy to survive if you lose a few clients, right? For people like us who have a few clients and we're relying on those few clients, whatever money that we make, we're trying to invest it again in building that, bootstrap business. It becomes very difficult when we can't grow our client base and we can't raise an investment. So we sort of got stuck in that place. So decided to move. That was my Groom Baba story. You guys can feel free to ask me any questions. I'll be more than happy to share. I think these are the little things. Whenever I talk about these stories, I think the little things matter the most, because these stories, tomorrow I go to your story and I give an interview, they'll ask me all these, and the general story will be out there, right? General story you can just find about any entrepreneur, any business, but then it's all in the details and it's all in the struggles that the real story is, that you actually understand what went wrong and what didn't. Maybe I'm forgetting something, but then you guys feel free to ask me.
Yeah.
That's yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this was something that we also saw happening with Zomato and Swiggy, wherein the restaurants started to delist themselves from the app. So, I mean, it becomes a very competitive world out there, no? When too many people are in the business and trying to do the same thing as you are doing, and then that part to try and differentiate yourself, like as we call ourselves the differentiators, like what was your basic criteria that you were relying on, that differentiating factor that you would that you could use to try and pitch to the clients?
Oh, for us, when we began, it was a very simple concept. The concept did not exist at that point, wherein you could just book appointments. In fact, I don't think to date, if you want to go for a haircut or you want to go for any of the salon services, there is any company big enough as Book My Show. Like if you want to watch a movie, the first thing that you think of is Book My Show. Go to Book My Show, book a ticket, right? PVR tried to do it, coming up with their own app, but did not take off. Book My Show is the market leader now, right? So there's still none. I do not see any. I mean, you guys tell me if you guys use, but then that was the. Sorry.
Not at this point of time, because people have moved to streaming, right? Amazon and Netflix.
Yeah. So right. So not Book My Show. I'm saying from a salon and spa point of view, if you want to book appointments. But then that was the whole premise. What we wanted to do for businesses was give them more business. We wanted to technologically enable them so that people sitting at home, instead of coming to the salon and waiting, or realizing that the stylist that they want is not available. See, for us guys, it's still okay, but then a lot of the female audience are very choosy and very picky, right? So for them, it becomes important that they go to the right person and the right time, and we wanted to streamline that process and enable them technologically. That's what we wanted to do, and that was premise good enough for the businesses, for our partners. This is to grow the business. Now, if you pitch this to an investor, it would seem like a not so innovative idea, or not something that is very different.
Yeah.
They would be like, anybody can do this, right? Now the difference, they're right. They think that way because they think whatever differentiates is something that would be able to raise the next round. And for every investor, raising the next round becomes important because that's how they liquidate. That's how they make money. So that becomes important for them. So they're right in their own place. But then you need to do the business, and business, even if it's fairly simple and if it pays you, it pays you. That's your business, right? So to answer your question, Yashas, to begin with, this was good enough. Moving forward, we worked on an app as well. We never launched the app, but we worked on an app where, like I was mentioning, right, it was completely, instead of booking an appointment with the salon, we shifted completely to booking an appointment with a stylist. So it didn't matter if a stylist was today working for, Javed Habib, and then tomorrow moves to Lakme, for example, but the stylist remains the same, right? So we were pushing consumers more towards the stylist. So that app was that. It was could say Zomato for stylists. So you could rate and you could give feedback and all of that. So that is where we were going ahead with, and that was our differentiating factor. And that's where we pitched to investors, and investors always ask for that differentiating factor. And I do not think anyone to date is still doing that, something that is focused on the stylist rather than salons. So that was our differentiating factors to the investors, but businesses couldn't care less. All they want is, if you can bring us business, we're happy. That's what they want, right? So
yeah. So probably more if personalization was what you were looking at.
So when you started
actually,
out, did you think? Oh, sorry, just to cut you off.
yeah.
When you started out, did you think that a business like this would actually scale? There would be network effects applicable, as in the more stylish you get onto the platform, the more people would also come into the platform, and that would grow organically. Did you think something like this would happen when you started out?
So the idea behind it was exactly this, that it was way more scalable because now you are operating in operating between two consumers instead of a business and a consumer, right? Now you're enabling stylists to sign up as a stylist, and then you're also enabling consumers to approach the stylist directly.
Right.
So now businesses like bigger businesses like Lakme and Javed Habib, all those people, we don't have to deal with those businesses directly. Now this is scalable both ways.
Yeah.
As you do more marketing and branding activity, more stylists can just come on your platform, and then people would start discovering these stylists, book an appointment directly with the stylist, and go to them instead of going to a salon. So that way, it became C to B to C sort of a model.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, if you think it is actually similar to what CureFit is doing in their platform. So they have doctors come onto their platform, and as more number of doctors come in, so more number of people who are in their who explore CureFit online gyms and stuff, online workouts. So even they are allowed to book appointments. So sounds pretty simple.
Right. For that matter, that's what Practo also did.
Yeah.
Right? Practo brought doctors straight. You get doctors and reviews on doctors and ratings on doctors, and you go to that doctor, because that doctor is the one who's going to be servicing you, not the hospital.
Right.
Doesn't matter which hospital the doctor belongs to. So doctor could belong to a hospital and have his private clinic, but a doctor is the same.
Sure.
So yeah.
So coming to Practo, so you had Groom Baba and you had experience with customers as well. So why didn't you scale it to doctors? You didn't get the idea of the doctors, right?
At that point, I'll answer that question.
Business.
So any other you'll have to mention. I didn't really want to get into the food business, so definitely wasn't doing restaurants or wasn't starting Swiggy. Why I didn't do doctors is, in fact, I still believe in this. The hospitals and the healthcare infrastructure in India needs to undergo a massive shift for any technology to happen, because a lot of Indian healthcare system is rigged with a lot of operational problems first. When everything is operationally streamlined, that's where you bring in technology, and then things begin to make sense. Practo started. I will not comment on how well they're doing. You guys can go ahead and read it. But then with whatever Practo is also doing, Practo tried to do that. Is still trying to do that, where they're trying to connect patients to doctors. One, it is a lot of sensitive information that's not being handled properly. So I mean, patient data and all of that is still a sensitive information, not being handled properly. And since I had that healthcare background, I was very wary and conscious about all of that, right? So at Deloitte, I had that healthcare stint. So I was very wary of that. That was one. And second is doctors, and this is again experience working with other startups and other businesses who have started in similar fields, right? So what I've seen is a lot of in India, reality is that you go B2B, pulling money out of the business is a challenge. And this challenge is increasingly, this is an increasingly difficult problem with hospitals and educational institutions, right? So doing it for, let's say, students, anything for students. Example, you do like a placement wherein you bring in, you have a technology product where there are companies who can publish their job posts and students can apply. So creating a platform for that. The problem is you could do that. It's a good problem to solve, but then milking money out of educational institutions and hospitals, or in fact doctors, is even more difficult. Doctors is especially difficult because these hospitals don't really pay doctors. Same with educational institutions. The teachers don't get paid as much, right? So you can't, it's almost unfulfilling to milk money from doctors and teachers. And it's very difficult to milk money from institutions, educational and healthcare institutions. So that was, that is the understanding I have, the understanding and maturity that I have after studying after working with these markets and observing them closely now. But then I think I just did not want to venture into anything else at that point. Also, I'll tell you another reason why it's important, because once you start talking to investors and you have investors in your network, it is not, some of the investors, they do not see it as something of, I'm just trying to put this in the best way possible. They don't see it as, they don't see you as a stable founder. If this is some of the investors, not all of them, they don't see you as a stable founder if you just suddenly pivot from one industry to a completely different industry, right? For a lot of investors in the same industry, you can pivot to a slightly different problem. You can pivot, you can start working on a slightly different, product, right? But then if you completely pivot the industry, they would be like, hey, just for the sake of doing it, whatever you want to do, you can't keep doing that. So that's the kind of mindset that they have. Also, investors have a portfolio and they are very fixed with the kind of industries that they want to invest in. Right? So if they want to invest in healthcare, they'll do healthcare. If they want to invest in beauty and fashion, they'll stick to that. So those are also some challenges. So it would mean that the investors and the network that we had built, we had to move to a completely different segment and build that again if I had moved to doctors, which was building the business from scratch pretty much.
So when did you shut down Groom Baba? Which year was this?
This was 2016.
2016. Okay. So was this, did you immediately start thinking about Nordforth at that point of time, or how did Nordforth start? Why did you start Nordforth?
Okay. So no, so at that point I had an alumnus of my college. He has a company called ShopX, which I joined. Right after that, I was out in the market and he came across. He said, "Hey, why don't you come and join?" So I joined them. It was a Nandan Nilekani project. ShopX, they were doing tier 2, tier 3 cities. So I worked for them. It was 2016 was a time where working for them, and I was also sort of helping a lot of startups with the experience that I had gained, right? So even during 2015-16, I was associated with a lot of startups. So I was helping a lot of them. So I was gaining a lot of experience, and then something hit me. This was fag end of 2016. I was also working with this company called Farm Taza, which was doing farm to retail stores model. So what Big Basket does is farm to direct home, but then this is farm to retail stores, which is what Ninja Cart is doing. I don't know if how familiar you are with it in Bangalore. So Farm Taza was doing that. So I was associated with them also. I was working for them. So these different industries and different experiences I started having. And that's when I realized that there is a huge problem, which is a big problem, with employees being happy in an organization. So what I had felt at Deloitte was completely different. The culture was completely different, and the culture in startups is completely different. And the culture has, so this is the way I define it, right? So Deloitte has built a culture over a period of time, right? For startups and for smaller startups, it's a culture that has that trickle down effect. Whatever the founders feel and believe, it's not necessarily dependent on the HR team, whatever the smaller teams, right? So whatever the founders, the culture and the backgrounds that they have, that's the culture that trickles down throughout the organization. Now, what happens with startups is, what happens with Deloitte is, Deloitte has a fixed process of hiring. So they have a certain metrics for hiring the right person into Deloitte. So when you hire somebody, the right person to your team or to your company, the culture fit happens. The person is able to perform, he's happy, he or she is happy, and the company is also getting the work that they want to get done. So that's the fit. In startups, what I had observed was that this fit doesn't happen. How startups function is, how startups hire is, they just go ahead and hire either based on the brand, that you've graduated from this college and you've worked with this company, so we'll hire you, right? Either based on that or based on your technical skills. Let's say you're good in Java or you're good at Python, we'll just hire you. But then there are so many more factors to it than being just good in the skill that you have. You need to be able to fit in that organization. And that's where the whole problem of attrition starts, where at company level, you hire so many people every year and people leave within a year. You know, Flipkart, for example, has 40% attrition rate. That means if they hire 100 people today, the next year, this 40% of people would just leave the company. The next year after that is another big chunk of people. So within 2 years, of the 100 people, you would be left with very few, 10 people, pretty much, right? So that kind of attrition is a problem because every new employee that joins the company has to go through training, has to adapt with the workplace, has to understand what and then start to perform. So it easily takes, even if you think from your own perspective, if you join a company, it will easily take you 2 to 3 months to actually sit and be able to figure out what the company is doing, adjust with the peers, and then actually start performing, right? So that is time and cost, time and money spent. You could minimize that. If there is a way, you could understand company culture, and if there is a way you could understand what a particular employee is, and then you could match those things, right? Deloitte does it inherently because they have various processes set for that. But then my question was, if there is a possibility that we can use technology and do this quantitatively, that means you could put numbers to it. Let's say your organization has a typical stress level at your organization is, let's say, at 90 out of 100, right? So organizations have that. Sales companies specifically have that kind of stress level, and you know that a particular individual can handle stress levels up to only 60. Some scale, I'm fixing some scale, right? So on a scale, a company is operating at 90, but you have an individual who can operate at 60. That individual may be working in some other company which was at 60 and he was performing very well. He may be a kick-ass salesperson in that company, but if you hire that person and put it in your company, from 60 to 90, this person will break. He will not be able to give you the performance that you need. So he's not a good hire. So can we decide that scale? That's the question that popped in my head. In 2017 is when I started Northport with the same purpose. Started with a completely different angle first. Did not think of a product like this. Started with a different angle. We wanted to. So all of this, when you start thinking about the scale, it becomes soft skills. You're essentially talking about soft skills that people have: communication, leadership, emotional intelligence, and all that. So once you start talking about it, in 2017, the way I started was completely a service-based model, a service-based approach, where we had trainers with us. We had onboarded some good 2022 international trainers we had onboarded. And then we started approaching companies. We had our training programs and modules and all of that. And we were just targeting that part. And then later we switched to a product where we built the product and we launched the product. We stopped the service part of it. We launched the product. And then the goal is to eventually combine both, so that the product and the service works together, so that you could identify who needs what and then give them the right training.
So this product and the service that you're talking about, so this works for companies which have already hired people, or this will also help them in hiring new potential recruits?
Okay, so this product is it's pretty interesting because it has multiple use cases. It's like a platform, right? So what you could do is it's completely up to the company. So you could, once you're able to quantitatively understand what an employee is or what his strengths and weaknesses are, then you could do multiple things. One, you know what your company's strengths and weaknesses, what a company parameters are, right? You could match that. So you could hire effectively. For employees that are already existing in that company, you could understand what that particular employee or a particular team is weak at, and you could give them selective training on that. So you could train your employees. And then once you train your employees, this tool will also help you understand if the training has been effective. So training effectiveness is another use case. You could bring in external trainers and then train them. But then did the employees really understand? Did the employees really improve? That's something that you would want. You're spending money, right, on a training session. So what happens to that money? So everything connected to money. So multiple use cases throughout this. Can I answer your question, Aditya?
Yeah.
So you talk about teams being a crucial part of a company.
Yeah.
So how do people select their teams, and what qualities do you see when you are recruiting a team?
So you're asking for me, or you're asking in general?
In general and for you. Okay. You have hired a few international coaches as well.
Yeah.
So how do you see them when you're hiring?
Right. So again, hiring them, I'll answer for the general part first. Hiring in general is, the way I see it, or from a completely Northport perspective, is a scientific process. It's not It's not just anything. It's not an HR process anymore. It's a scientific process, and that's what we're trying to introduce, right? So when I say scientific process, behavioral science has advanced so much in this field, but then the application of it in companies has not happened, and we are trying to bridge that gap where we are trying to bring in concepts of behavioral science. And so hiring the kind of person who would be right for your team. Obviously, team is important, and this importance especially becomes huge when it's a smaller team, smaller businesses, startups. Becomes huge, right? You have a 5-member team and one person decides to leave, you'll have to struggle your ass off to find the replacement for that 5th person, and you'll lose time, mind, and money over it like crazy, right? So compared to a 50,000 organ like TCS, for example, they hire 30,000 people, engineers every year, and then only 10,000 remain the next year, right? So they don't have a problem. They know they have to hire, keep hiring.
Yeah.
So team becomes very important for smaller organization. And how do you find the right team is depending on the kind of team that you have right now. It's a lot dependent on the team that you have right now. So the team that you have right now defines the culture of that team. Okay. And the person that you hire has to fit in that culture so that they can perform. This is the premise. It doesn't matter. There's a beautiful, this reminds me, there's a beautiful speech by Simon Sinek. I don't know if you guys have heard of the speech.
I was actually
Sinek,
about
right?
to go and ask about the same thing, because he talks about how leaders and the team constitute the major part of a company. The team,
right?
and
So
the culture.
Yeah. So there is an interesting analogy that he draws, right? So in US Navy that he talks about, there are he draws that graph where he says there is performance, and then there is trust, right? So there is this bracket. Nobody wants to hire the low performance, low trust person, right? Then there is a high trust and high performance person that everybody wants, but it's very rare, right? And then there is medium performance and high trust versus high performance and low trust. So between the two, what he says is the US Navy or the Navy officials or military in general would rather choose a medium performance, high trust person over a high performance, low trust person, because trust becomes very important over the performance. So in our case, what we could say is the skill versus the fit, right? So anybody who is low skill and poor fit to the organization, nobody wants. Anybody who is who's a perfect fit and a high skilled person, everybody wants, but very rare to get, right? And anybody who is a highly skilled person but has poor fit is the person that companies are hiring, and that's why attrition problem is there right now.
Okay.
But then what you would want is compromise on that performance, even if you get somebody who is high on fit, who has a better fit, even if the person is low on skills, medium on skills, for example. But then all of this, how do you identify? That's my question, right? So if I go and give this talk, or if I sit with a client and explain them this, they'll be like, wow, fantastic, but how do we do this? It's all great concept, great funda, but how do we actually do it, right? So is there a way we can actually measure the skills? Is there a way we can measure this is the skill of the person, and the fit is essentially the cumulative skills of the team? So you need to fit that. So you need to be able to understand that quantitatively, and because we are humans, understanding quantitatively comes very naturally to us, right? So just wanted to drop in. If you guys haven't watched that video, maybe I can forward that video to you after this, but then you should definitely watch it. We'll give you some context about it. But then that's what we're talking about here. Measuring, to be able to measure that skill and to be able to understand the cultural fit. To answer your question, Shreyas, this is the general funda, right? Now what I want, somebody specific that I would want is see, I am a person of, I'm somebody who believes in humility a lot, right? So I believe no matter what you achieve, no matter what you become in life, you should always have that humility to be able to talk to anyone. I have seen in my experience so far, I have come across so many people who have done nothing when it comes to building a business, but then they're just on cloud nine, and they act and behave like they're Bill Gates, right? So I have come across so many people like that, but then it actually doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help your cause. It may satisfy your ego for a while. It doesn't help your cause, right? And the reason why I do a lot of what I do, like talk to you guys or talk to other people or go and give sessions, is just investing time, right? It's actually planning for it and investing time in this. The reason I do all of that is during my time of learning, being an entrepreneur, and I'm still learning, but then during that time when I was really struggling to figure out a lot of these small things, I used to approach people, and unfortunately, I always used to get people who would just be on their own ego trip, and that really did not help me at all. Nobody actually sort of sat me down and told me that hey, this is real. I have gone through this myself, and this is what you can do. This is what you can do. You know, having that unbiased opinion and coming down to my level and explaining things to me. You might have achieved something great in life, but then I don't see that perspective yet. I don't have that maturity. So that's important to me. And anyone that I work with, I always look for that. I always look for someone who doesn't join my team with an ego trip. You may be anything, right? So I may hire somebody who is, you know, for marketing, but then he or she might be a very good dancer, for example, right? And they may have that ego trip that, hey, I'm the king of dancing, so you can't say shit to me, you can't do shit to me, and all of. So I don't want that psyche. I always want to operate. So this is one of the things, right? Shares to answer. There are multiple factors to this, but then I'm saying just for example. And how many people do you actually think in an organization realize this? In a startup, let's say 50 member startup, how many do you think actually realize this? That this is the kind of people that they want to work with. And once you identify that, it becomes so much easier to work with. Second thing, I want to work with people who have very good communication skills, because I believe I have. I'm very honest and open about a lot of things. So even if it's giving feedback, I'm very honest and open about giving feedback, at the same time receiving feedback, right? I might take a decision in any business decision that I might take. It might be completely flawed, or it might be very biased, and I might be doing the dumbest shit ever. But then I would really appreciate it if somebody walks up to me and says, this is shit, like you're doing a big mistake, right? That's the kind of people I want. I wouldn't want to work with just 5 folks who are just sitting around and just typing on their computer and, you know, just receiving instructions. I would be telling them this is what you have to do and just doing it. I wouldn't enjoy that. It's just very counterproductive. People who are involved, people who are passionate, people who have good communication skills and very open to communicate with whatever, right? So if let's say tomorrow they don't like, I had one employee who recently left. She was handling marketing for us, right? And I was the one who got her another job because she wanted to move because of a personal problem. She was so open about her personal problems with me. She wanted to move. She wanted something else. And then I was the one who found her a job. And that's the kind of relationship that I maintained. She was very open about it. This is not working out for me because of this reason, right? So, all right, it doesn't work for you, doesn't work for you. I'm sad because I've invested so much, right? In grooming or in training or in making her understand how I want things to be done and whatever. But then if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And then I would be the one who would help you find a job also. That's completely okay. So that's the kind of relationship. And this doesn't happen with a lot of people. And if it doesn't happen with people, I wouldn't want to work with them because it doesn't make me comfortable. Otherwise, what will happen is I'll just keep spending more and more time trying to drill down into what the person is actually thinking. For example, I hire you, Shreyas, right? I hire you as the marketing.
Please hire me.
Example. For example, right? So let's say you work with me on marketing, right? And marketing is a lot about ideas and ideation and discussion, right? What sort of content and what sort of strategy and how should a brand come out as and all of that. So while we are having that discussion, if let's say I'm the only one who's talking and I'm like, this is what it should be and this is what we should do. Maybe you have ideas. And if you just keep listening to what I'm saying and be like, okay, sure, we'll do this. Okay, sure, we'll do this. You're not adding any value, man, literally. For a lot of people, it's very difficult to speak up. I've seen this myself. For a lot of people, it's difficult to just come back, no matter how senior the person is or how senior or junior is. It's very difficult to say that, hey, this is very stupid. I really like people telling you this is very stupid.
Yeah.
Right? I would challenge them. I would say that I'll debate with you if you tell me something stupid. I'll debate with you. I'll debate my ass off. But then I'll also be open to it and I really appreciate it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. It brings me to another question. Since my teammates are here and half the teammates are here, so how do you get the team to reply to you? How do you challenge them?
How do you challenge them?
Yeah.
I think this question you had asked me when I was there at ISBR also.
Yes.
A little differently, okay. But it's coming down to the same point, yeah.
Coming down to the same point. So I think my answer, I don't know what my answer was, but I think it will be the same because it's the genuine truth. You need to first understand if there is anything else that your co-founders want. Like if all of you are starting a company today, all of you need to see, everybody has a motive. Everybody has an end goal. Being an entrepreneur, for some people, being famous could be an end goal. Making a lot of money could be an end goal. Serving a lot of people could bring them happiness and satisfaction. So you need to sit together and have that kind of communication. Communicate, man. What's the problem in communicating? I do not understand. See, first of all, tomorrow when you're growing, you're hiring more people, right? If you want to hire the right people, you need to have this kind of communication with your hires also. You need to ask them what motivates you. My interviews, I ask them what motivates, what do you want to do? Forget your Java, Python skills. What do you do otherwise? What motivates you? Who are you as a human being? You need to understand that. You need to get that fundamental with people, especially co-founders. So once you understand that, then communication channels open up, man. It doesn't matter if you do it over drinks. You get really high and do it. Doesn't matter, but do it. Build that bond with your founders.
Sure.
Something that something that breaks my heart when I see a company doing very good with a very good business idea and extremely talented folks working on it and doing very good job at execution, but the company breaks apart because founders just don't work well together. Breaks my heart, man.
Yeah.
Don't let that happen. Just communicate. Whatever it is. Tomorrow you don't feel somebody is talking, call them up and say that, fuck, you're not talking to me, man.
Yeah, that brings me to the, I have a question on your previous response that you gave. So you were mentioning that you want your employees to be honest and compassionate, right? And also how you let someone go and you found a job for her. So yeah, I understand what you're saying. I get that, but also while you're doing that, at the same time, you've got a business to run as well. So how do you find this right balance? So how far are you willing to be compassionate with someone to meet their needs and to make them, to get them what they want, and at the same time also running a business. So how do you find that right balance there? Because the person that you let go, she might be very valuable to you as well in terms of in your day-to-day business as well. So how do you find that right balance?
I am, I would say, to answer very unbiased to this question, if you were somebody who didn't know me or who hasn't met me, you would probably think that I'm very biased towards the compassion part of it. I'm more inclined towards that than considering the business outcomes of my decisions. The reason is, and that might look very stupid to you. For a lot of people, it's very stupid.
It's not stupid,
right?
because LinkedIn's former CEO of LinkedIn, Jeff Weiner, talks a lot about this. Talks a lot about compassion in management and how that culture is imbibed within LinkedIn. So I don't think it's stupid, but this is something which I wanted to know honestly. So which is why I was asking.
Right. So perspective. So I am more in. So the way I look at it is, if let's say somebody who wants to leave sticks with the organization. Shreyas, what is it? You find it funny? You have a question?
No, I had a question regarding. I'll ask you later.
Okay, hold on. So let me complete this and then you can ask me that question. So the way I see it is, if you call it compassion, obviously, but then if somebody is not happy working with you, it does no good to them. It does no good to you. Even with founders, same thing. If somebody is not happy, right, they don't communicate with you. Linking back to the same communication question, right? Something is not right. They're not communicating. They don't want to talk about it. There's something is not right. Anything, co-founder, even in fact, relationships also, right? If something is not right, what do? You talk about it, right? So if somebody doesn't want to be in a place, you really can't force them to be there. You really can't force somebody to be in your company. That does no good. They'll not work. They'll not enjoy working. Eventually, the whole negativity sort of spreads throughout the team. And that's just very counterproductive, especially for smaller teams. Just doesn't work. So it's better to let them go if they want to go. It's better to build a happy workplace than build a productive workplace at the expense of happiness.
Right. So Shreyas,
okay, you have answered my question. So I'll be asking another question. So you were speaking about Bill Gates, and you were one of the guys who was selected in the Bill Gates Association, right? The Melinda Bill Gates Foundation had
nominated.
No, so I was not. There was no association of any sort. Bill and Melinda Gates, they don't run an association. They don't select people. It was a study that they conducted. There was a study wing of Bill and Melinda Gates, and they identified and nominated certain individuals as influential and who can contribute to that study.
Right.
So in Bangalore, there were 20 people, approximately 20 people who they nominated as influential entrepreneurs who could contribute to the study. And they did an interview. They asked me questions about, various industries and how entrepreneurship has impacted these industries and whatnot. With that study, I was a part of it. There were some bright people who were part of it. Binny Bansal was part of it as well. So there were some other folks who you might be knowing who were also part of that study. It was just that. There is no association that Bill and Melinda Gates run where they give you an award. This is not an award of any sort.
Bill and Melinda Gates.
What was your question about it?
No, I just wanted to know why you were selected and how was the process there? What did they do?
There was no process. Somebody nominated me and I kept drilling it till the last moment. I kept asking them who nominated me. They never told me because it's a very, not a very transparent thing. They don't want to reveal it. So I just got a phone call one day. They said, this is what we're doing. And then somebody nominated you. So this is a study. We would like you to contribute. Then they sent me an email, and then they fixed a time, and then the interview happened. That's it. And then there was about a year later, around 2017, they published the results of the study that they conducted. So that's where they invited all those people, and that's when I came to know that it's a very small set. Earlier, I had no clue. It could have been 500 people that they would have said are influential people. But then it was only a very small set. So that's good.
Coming to
Yashas got a
NordFath, so coming to NordFath, wherein you were talking about how important it is to quantify the measures of how people are and to determine if they're a proper cultural fit. So I wanted to know, how do you actually start to quantify that aspect of someone being culturally being a proper fit to another organization? Because at the end of the day, human beings are like, organic. The metrics keep changing. So how do you actually go into that aspect of quantifying that cultural fit?
Okay. So when it comes to, I'll answer your question. When it comes to organization as such, from what the pilots and the case studies that we have done, something that we've realized is organizational, there are certain parameters that we've identified as cultural parameters for an organization, right? Happiness is one of them, morale is one of them, stress level is one of them. So there are some parameters that we've identified. So those parameters more or less remain the same for larger organizations because it's like an average. Average more or less remains the same. So for a bigger organization like Deloitte, the happiness level across the board will be at some level. So now if 10 employees leave and another 10 employees join, the average doesn't move that much. Okay. So this is at a company level. So you can easily identify what the company is about, right? If the company, now based on this, the company has to choose what they want to focus on. It is possible that most of their employees are at, let's say, 60% happy. Most of their employees, that's the average, the company happiness. Now, they can choose to work on this and improve the employee happiness by hiring people who are in general workplace, they're more happy. So hire a 70, 80, and over a period of time, once all these 60, 50, 40s keep living in 70, 80, so over a period of time, the average changes. The overall happiness of the workplace changes. You can choose to do that. That's a decision that the company has to make. At an individual level, how we do it is right now we do it through questionnaires. We have situational simulations where let's say we give Yash as a situation, a very corporate situation, and then we ask you, how would you react to that situation? Right? Based on your reactions, we sort of derive your fundamental behavioral patterns. These are not skill sets, we derive behavioral patterns. That in this situation, this is how you would behave. So on, let's say, A, B, C, D behavioral parameters, you'll get this score. Now, a different situation, you would be mapped to those score accordingly. And then your scores will keep changing. And you're right, these things vary. People are organic. These things continuously change over time. For example, happiness, for example, stress levels from the case studies that we have done. Stress levels are typically high before the rating time, right? The company does promotions and ratings, right? So just before that time and all of that happens, the stress levels typically go high for all the employees because they want promotion and they want a better rating and all of that. So that's a trend that we've seen. So things keep changing. You're right about it. But then there is also that average that we operate on. We don't look at the high stress period as the stress level, but then the average. And then you map that to that employee. And even from an employee perspective, you can understand a lot of, we can talk about this at length. I can talk for hours and hours, but then behavioral science is advanced so much that there are 2,365 skills that a human being has, right? Imagine that's the level of breaking down that has happened. So if you can understand each and quantify each of them, it's possible to quantify. Right now with technology and machine learning and all of that, it's possible to train and retrain your model and all of that. So we can get into the technical discussion, but it's possible to understand a human being at depth, quantify his or her behaviors, and then scale it up to an organization, understand the organizational behavior, and define the culture of the organization based on the organizational behavioral parameters, and then map that to an individual and see where the individual is lacking or is strong at.
That's fascinating.
That's something actually even I had, I was actually thinking about. How does, my question, another question would be, in your experience, how much does an attitude of a person actually impact their cultural fit? Do you actually measure something of that sort?
What do you mean by attitude? Attitude is a very general term. It can be broken down into multiple things. What do you mean by attitude?
Uh, the way they approach work. I mean, because attitude, as I see, suppose a person who has a higher perseverance levels, let's say, given any job, they'll probably sit down with it, ensure that they complete it. So that kind of an attitude, does it? Do you look at that aspect as well? I mean,
So
does
that's
it
work
actually
ethic.
influence the cultural fit?
That's actually work ethic, right? So there are some work ethic is definitely something that we measure. But then again, see, Yashas, what you have to understand is this is the interesting part. This is where you as a company, you have to identify what is it that you want. There is all this lean methodology of working and all of that, where people have meetings and they just brainstorm, they pivot within a product team of a company, right? So if you look at it, I've seen this sort of a team myself, right? So what they do is they actually don't complete anything. They do a lot of things, but they don't do anything to completion. They work on a lot of products, right? They work on a lot of ideas. They start working on a lot of products. They come up with a product requirement document. They push it to the engineering team. Engineering team's taking the load. They're building, and they call this innovation. Innovating within the company, right? They're coming up with new products. So if there is nothing, this is an approach, right? It's a well-known approach. A lot of companies are following this approach. If you're a person if you want somebody who fits in this or this sort of an organizational behavior, right? This is a team behavior. This is what you want. You would want somebody with lower work ethic, essentially, because you put somebody who likes to finish things, who likes to take something and do it till the end into a team like this, that fellow will suffer, will not be able to deliver, will not like working in that company. But that person will be like, what, you're not doing anything. You're just, jumping from one idea to the other and building everything. You're not doing anything to completion. Whereas person with a lower score on work ethic, it doesn't mean they have poor work ethic. They just fit better in a different setup. You know what I mean? So identifying that and fitting those people into that particular setup works best for them.
Right. So coming back to working conditions and how hiring happens. So do you think because of this pandemic, future of hiring and the way companies hire, that will change? Any change at all that you foresee in the future?
I'm relying on it. As a business, I'm completely relying on it. I hope things change, and I really hope this pandemic works in favor of us. I think what will happen is, again, I might be entirely biased because I'm in this business, but I think what will happen is people will see, people are already firing, so they're making smaller and smaller teams.
Yeah.
Now, since the economy is shrinking, they're making smaller and smaller teams. They want to know if they had 50-member team and now they're a 10-member team, they want to know those 10-member team, they are going to stick in the organization, one. And second, they want them to be high performing 10 employees. So that the business grows, but at the same time, they're also sticking. That means they're happy working there and they're also performing. So this, I think there will be a shift where people would want to understand what makes employees fit in a company, what makes them happy, and what sort of skills, the soft skills that I think now is the time when companies will start looking at soft skills before hiring. And I'm relying completely on that. And that's where we come in. So I think that shift will happen. But then, yeah, to answer your question, hiring is going to be extremely selective. That's the way I'm seeing it. It's not going to be mass hiring, or companies are going to be extremely lean. Even bigger companies, they're going to be the shift has already happened, right? So in the last few months, I have seen some companies, or I've heard from my friends in the US, and typically what happens in the US, Indian companies also tend to follow in a few years, right? That's the unfortunate truth. But then in the US, from what I've heard, is the culture of ownership has started, right? So within companies, shares dropped out, I think.
I think he might be facing connectivity issues. Yeah, I think he'll join. Yeah.
Okay. So what I've seen is within the companies, they have ownership, so product ownership. Let's say they have one product, and then they create a team where they assign product ownership to one person. So he becomes the product CEO.
Yeah.
So now everything about that product comes under him or her. So they have their dedicated, so there is no one engineering team, one product team. They're all small mini teams, and every mini team is operating as a startup in itself. So that shift has started, and that's interesting because now every mini team has a choice of their own. They can hire whoever they want to. They have their own set of cultures that they want to operate with. So, and because they're smaller, everybody matters. People matter, right? So when every individual matters, you got to look at people's performance. For companies like TCS and Cognizant and Infosys and all of that, those companies hire in bulk. It's okay. See, you know the truth, right? So TCS and all Accenture and all those companies, they hire in bulk, and then they just retain. If you don't work, they'll put you on bench. They'll not fire you. It's very difficult to get fired from TCS, by the way. You have to kill somebody to get fired, right? So yeah. So that, I think, shift will happen, where people will start hiring. Instead of 10,000 people, people will hire 1,000 people, but then they want to make that investment on those 1,000 people very selectively. And when it comes to the question of selectively hiring, they would want to understand the behavioral patterns of people. They want to know if they've hired the right people. I think that shift will happen. I'm relying on it.
Interesting. I have one last question. So before that, if Shreyas and Yashas, if you guys have something, then go ahead.
Yeah, Balaji, about the retention policies, how do companies retain people?
How do companies retain people? That's a very broad question. Depends from one company to the other. Retention policies of technology companies are particularly very poor. The retention policies are very poor. They do not have, what do you say? The people are pretty free to leave whenever they want to. So you would see a lot of people migrating from, TCS to Cognizant to all these companies, Infosys, and within a year they'll just migrate because pay hike and salary hike and all of that. So people would migrate, and it's completely okay.
In startups?
In startups, depends on startup. There are startups where I've seen people have signed contracts with people saying, if you hire, you have to stick with us for 5 years. That's something that is a way, right? Carrots and sticks. Stick is a way where you just sign contracts with employees and say that you have to be with us for 5 years. That's one way. The other way of retaining employees is, that's the carrot way, is, all these trips, and you put people, you have vacations and trips and all of that. So incentivizing employees is the only other way that companies retain. Technology startups, again, same. From an industry point of view, technology startups have very high attrition rates. That means very loose retention policies for employees, right? Versus manufacturing companies. Manufacturing and automobile and all of that, if you go to that, then people have contracts, right? And they have contracts, and that is one. And second, it's a common myth that people say if we keep upskilling our workforce, they'll stick with us. It's not because of the upskilling that people stick with. There is a lot of the low layer or the engineering level, low tier of the employee, right? Low salary tier of the organization, especially for manufacturing, that's a lot, right? So those people, they stick, has a lot to do with demography also. So let's say I set up a plant in Tamil Nadu. I hire engineers from Tamil Nadu. They want to work in Tamil Nadu only because they know Tamil. They want to work in Tamil Nadu. They don't want to move to Karnataka. They don't want to move to Andhra Pradesh or whatever, right? So they stick with that. So that's also a major factor. But in terms of retention, there are just two things. One is incentivization that employers do in some way. That is either, bonuses is one way, appraisals is one way, then trips and vacations and trainings is another way, where people take you've heard of this, right? Companies take outdoors and they go to a resort and all of that. So
yeah,
those things happen. So that all these are incentivizations, and then contracts is a way where they make people stick. If you work with us, we'll do. There is startups especially have this. Startups have this ESOP concept where they give equity to early employees, and then ESOP has a vesting schedule on top of that. That means you have a 4-year vesting period where your matures, 25% of it matures every year.
yes.
So it's only if you stay for 4 years, you'll get the 100% of whatever they promised. That's another way. That's a way of incentivization.
So Balaji, you also speak about work-life balance. And what are your thoughts about work from home and how do people manage work and the life? After the COVID situation, work from home has been a normal.
Work from home has been a normal, yes.
Yeah. So now, for example, I call my friends at 11 o'clock. Now they are even busy at 11 o'clock. They have meetings at 11 o'clock, which was not the normal when they were, it was pre-COVID.
So you're saying the workplace is shifting, and what are my thoughts on that? It's bound to happen, man. It's bound to happen. And especially the work hours and with the work from home and remote working and lesser number of employees. See, again, coming back to the point, right? From 50 employees, if you switch to 10 employees, the workload is going to remain the same. They want to grow the business. They want those 10 people to be more productive. So either you be more productive or you join an organization that matches your level of productivity or your level of work-life balance comfort that you have, or the company is going to keep pushing down your throat. And it's happening, and I think this is there to continue. It's going to happen for long, and only those people would stick. Again, see, migration will happen with these 10 people. If let's say you don't like working for more than 10 hours, right? You would, after this is over, right? After the economy starts picking up and there are jobs in the market. Right now, jobs are not there in the market. So when there are jobs in the market, you would naturally start looking out for roles where you can only work for 10 hours and not more, right? And those would be companies where originally they would be actually working for only 5 hours, but now they're working for 10 hours. But that's comfortable to you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that migration will also happen. For people who can take tougher loads, they would be happy with wherever they are. Or in fact, they would move to an organization which says, hey, you'll have to work for, they'll not say it openly. They'll not say it on your, offer letter also. But then it will be an inherent thing where they'll be like, you'll have to work for 15 hours and we'll pay you so much. We'll obviously pay you a lot. But then if you're okay working for 15 hours, go for it. Amazon, for example, has crazy work hours. It normally had. And now they have more. Right? So it's bound to happen. I like working for, you make me work for 15 hours, I'll be more than happy to work. So I'm that kind of a person. So there are different kind of people. If you like working for it, I would probably move to Amazon and say, if you're paying more, then I would be more than happy to work because I like working. I don't have a problem. So that's how the shift is going to happen. But then, yeah, another important point, because you brought this up, was that I wanted to talk about is the productivity aspect of it. You're working for 10 hours from home, but are you actually that productive? That's something that I'm observing constantly. And productivity in general, working in office versus working home is going to differ. My feeling is that you're going to be more productive working from home than working in an office, because from what I've seen is you have access at home. You don't have people. The biggest thing is you don't have people to spend and kill time with. So you're not really chit chatting over chai and coffee, and you're not really playing. If your office has table tennis and whatnot, right? You're not really going and playing all of that. So whatever time you're logging in at particular time, you're going to spend that working. So in terms of the number of hours and the productive hours that you spend on working is going to be more. So productivity, in my opinion, will go up. And again, if the working hours are going to go up, people would want to be more productive because they want to reduce that. So if there's 10 hours of workload, they'll not be chilling around. They would want to finish it as soon as possible in 8 hours and then get on with their lives. So yeah, those changes are going to happen.
So when we're talking about hiring, what will be the top 3 skills that you're seeing after this pandemic?
What are the skills that I'm seeing after this pandemic?
Yeah, what will be the top 3 skills that will be needed going forward after this pandemic ends?
Okay, so top 3 skills. Number 1 would be communication. It's the most important skill that you're going to need, because let's say you have a team and you've given the task to somebody, you really do not know if the person is working or not, or how much the person is completing. You're completely in the dark, right? It's the same with the remote working also. You need to set up a schedule with people wherein you depending on how you want to run the organization, you could reach out to them every week, or you could ask them for a weekly report, or a daily report, or you get on a call with them daily and give them the task, whatever. But then that sort of communication needs to happen. From your end, it will happen because either you're the founder or you're the manager, for example. But then for all the downline, for all the people, they need to be able to communicate effectively to you, saying they need to understand this is the task I have at hand, and communicate back to you saying this is what I have done. So communication becomes very important. Number 1. Second, like you said, work ethic. A higher work ethic would be required than whatever the organizations were operating at, whatever their level was, right? I'm not going to get into the quantifiable aspect of it, but then whatever their level was, whatever the work ethic was, it needs to be higher, and the expectation is going to be more because they want the tasks to be completed. And because of the uncertainty of will it be completed or not, the expectations is gonna rise. Get it? So communication, work ethic, top 2. You asked for 3, right? I think this is a very subjective one, but depending on company to for a lot of companies, this may not be required, but I think a little bit of leadership skills is also something that would be in demand at any level, because like I said, ownership of the things that you do at any level, right? Even the smallest to the smallest task, you need to own it, because that's when, again, from 50 to 10 companies come down to, so that much amount of task, if you're relying on 10 people instead of 50 people, those 10 people need to own it and they need to do their job well, right? And owning your job is what leadership is about. It's an important aspect of leadership. So I think that also ownership and leadership is also something that would be looking at. But that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it. This is on top of my head. It's an interesting question.
Yeah. So my last question would be on entrepreneurship in general. So do you think, especially for people, if someone of the age of 22, 23 or 24 years old is watching or listening to this,
Yeah.
do you think, would you advise them to go for entrepreneurship? Do you think, that would be, so to speak, a lucrative career moving forward? So do you think it's a choice that helps them in the future? So what is your advice for people who want to take up entrepreneurship in the future? Or maybe they're just trying to figure out what they want to do. They're kind of confused. Maybe they're in their job now, they want to move out. So how would you advise on choosing entrepreneurship to those kind of people?
Okay, so entrepreneurship, I'll again answer this question. There are two folds to this question. One is entrepreneurship is a career choice, yes, but it is also a lifestyle. It's a mindset, and people need to get in that mindset early on. And this change, no matter what I feel about it, this change is already happening in India. At least there are, I know Delhi schools have started courses on, there are some schools that have introduced courses on entrepreneurship, right? There are some colleges that are introducing courses on entrepreneurship all over India. So that change is already happening. That means there would be people who, like US already has courses on entrepreneurship, right? They have their undergraduate courses and you could do entrepreneurship. That same typical is happening in India. So people would be coming out as entrepreneurs. If taught well, they would be coming out with an entrepreneurial degree and they would want to start something of their own right off the bat. So irrespective of what I feel about it, that change is happening. Now, what I think people should be doing is something that I would not directly advise anyone for. I wouldn't advise anyone on anything without knowing context. It's very important, right? So that is, if Aditya, I have to ask you, what do you want to be? That's something that I would want to ask you before I can actually suggest you should be an entrepreneur, right? I can't just directly say entrepreneur is a lucrative career, you should go for it. I will not say that. For example, right now, let's say farming is a great place to be right now, because Indian government is doing so much and there are funds and there are tax relaxations and all of that. You could make real money right now with farming. But then, are you interested in that? Do you want to be a farmer? Then you shouldn't be. The answer is simple. Our education system is changing and we have more and more alternative career paths right now. That is true. But then you have to choose what you want to be. Being an entrepreneur is going to be increasingly easy going forward, because we have so many, that has become a career option. First of all, it was not a career option. It was always seen as a detour from your regular career. Now this detour is becoming a full-fledged path. Right? So since it's becoming a full-fledged path, there's going to be more investment and things are going to be easier. If colleges are starting entrepreneurship courses, they're going to be incubators and accelerators, and colleges themselves is going to invest in a business. And things for you to try and test out an idea, things are going to be way easier. So you can always go ahead for that, and that change will happen irrespective of what I feel. But personally, I just think you should do it if you want to do it. And I would just say that being an entrepreneur has been an immense learning experience for me. Immense. That I'm just more than happy to share with people. And if you're that kind of a person who likes learning and who likes helping people in some way, like even if it's being custom, being an entrepreneur is not just about money. That's just very shallow. So many people come and say that I want to be a millionaire and I want to start a business. What's the $1 million idea? That just feels very shallow to me, right? I want to raise this much investment because I want to buy a house or I want to buy this car. And I've heard there was one interesting fellow who came and said that there was a VC firm which invests 50 million and above check size. and then they also give you a car. Right? It happens. To the founders, they give you a car, they buy it. That happens. So they wanted to approach that VC, and they were like, I want to approach that VC because I really want a Jaguar. Like, that's not the right approach at all, right? That's not why you build a business. So people do it for different reasons. I do it because of the learning and because I'm actually able to make a difference at a smaller scale. And then once I scale the business at a bigger scale, being able to bring a dent, for the lack of better words, right? Being able to bring a dent or bring an innovation in the world where, world is a certain way. And because I did something, it has changed for better. That's what drives me. And that's a good enough reason for me to be an entrepreneur. Reason could be something else for you.
Right.
For some people, it could just be making money. A lot of people get into stock market because they want to make money.
Yeah.
Right? And they lose a lot of money.
Yeah.
Most of them lose money. That's why a little small percentage make money. So
It's true.
Sure.
So yeah, it depends on what your motivation is. But then if you're up for the learning part, up for failing, up for the complete roller coaster ride, and if you're up for that, then go for it. And I think it's gonna get easier from now on because there's more support than ever.
Right. Yeah. You guys have anything else to ask? Yes, Shreyas.
I think we've
Yes.
touched most of the points that we wanted to talk on this podcast, at least. So I think it's been a great learning session for all of us as well.
It's fascinating to understand how you started off your journey. I think we did not speak all this when we met you last time. So yeah. This was fascinating conversation. So yeah, thank you so much, Balaji, for agreeing to do this. Thank you so much for tuning in, and for everyone else who are watching and probably listening to this. So in the description below, I'll also provide a link to Balaji's LinkedIn profile, and also he has his own YouTube channel. So I'll provide a link to that as well. So you can watch and hear a lot of what he has to say, on his LinkedIn profile or also on his YouTube channel. So thank you so much for tuning in. It was a great conversation. We learned a lot, especially I learned a lot. So if I have to speak for myself, so thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much, Balaji. Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in. We have lots more to come on this channel since we have lined up a few more guests after this. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe and hit the bell icon to receive updates. In the description below, I have provided the LinkedIn page link. Follow us on LinkedIn to receive new notifications. So until next time, it's goodbye.